Hey, what's up, everyone? And thank you for listening to the Sobriety Social Podcast. My name is Joshua Hill, and I am your host. First and foremost, I want to say happy Thursday to everyone listening, or I guess whatever day it may be that you came across the show. It means so much to me, those of you that continue to tune in and listen to these episodes every single week. I hope you continue to be encouraged and blessed by these episodes, and you've been able to continue to push forward in your recovery and make tons of growth. Or if you have a loved one that's going through recovery and this is something that you listen to, I hope it's a place where you've been able to continue to learn more about what they may be going through and how you can continue to come alongside and support them. One of the first things I want to just big ask for you with this show today is, if you haven't already, it would mean so much to me if you could go over to iTunes and give the show 5 stars. It's the number one way that more people can hear about this show and be encouraged in your recovery. I know that's something I usually do at the end of the show, but I just figured I would get that out of the way and give that big ask right away to get started. Also, one more piece of housekeeping. For those of you that have been listening along all season, I'm sure you are wondering, has baby number 2 come along? And the answer is not yet. We are still waiting, but my wife, Heaven, she is very close. She had a doctor appointment today, and they pretty much said it could happen anytime. So thank you so much for your prayers and continuing to keep us in the forefront of your mind as we are getting ready to welcome this second baby into our family. But yeah, as far as the podcast and the season goes, we are in season number 2, episode 8. And in today's episode, we are going over step number 8 of the 12 steps. And that step is, we made a list of all the persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Let's read that again. We made a list of all the persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. This, my friends, is a very difficult step. I think just hearing that, you can immediately start thinking to yourself of some of the people that you maybe you have harmed, and you are not really in a position where you're ready to talk to those people. And I want to, for starters, this is something that I bring up very often in the show, and especially if you've been listening to this season, but it's so important to do these steps in order. So if you are early in your recovery, I would encourage you not to be overwhelmed by this step, or if this is not the step that you are currently working, don't allow this to be a roadblock for you continuing to move forward. One of the beautiful things about the steps is that they continue to build a foundation, and they keep building on each other. And so if you're not at this step, I would likely think that by the time you arrive to this step, then you would be more in a position where you are ready to take on the task of starting to think through the people that you have harmed along the way and begin to make amends. But if you're not there yet, don't worry. So much of the first steps are starting to kind of deal with yourself and deal with some of your insecurities and deal with your shortcomings and working through admitting some of the ways that you have hurt people and harmed people. And so I would just encourage you, keep focusing on the step that you're on, keep working with your sponsor or whoever it is that you are walking this recovery journey with. And when you arrive to this step, you will feel, I think, a lot more comfortable to take on the step. But there's a few questions that come up when I think about this step, and I think I'd just like to take some time today and go through those questions and just kind of tell you what my thoughts are about them. But first and foremost, I think the most important question that is to be asked is, why is this step important? And I think, firstly, this step is incredibly important because it's another opportunity for us to start moving outside of ourselves in our recovery. We've spent so much time in our addictions, focusing solely on ourselves. How can I feed the appetite of my own flesh? How can I make myself feel good? How can I numb out the pain of whatever I'm feeling? How can I continue to serve the call of my flesh of wanting to give that what it wants? And the reality is, in recovery, we are learning to start thinking outside of ourselves, understanding that our actions affect other people. And the beautiful thing about this step, making a list of all the people we had harmed and becoming willing to make amends to them all, it's really starting to continue to keep us in the mindset of thinking about other people and how we can continue to focus our minds on things other than just what makes us feel good and how to help ourselves. And also, it's allowing us to come to grips with how much damage we really have done in our recovery. I think it's incredibly easy for us to, especially early on in recovery, but even if you've had some long-term recovery, it's, as addicts, we are just inherently selfish creatures. And I think the reality is it can be so easy for us to forget that there are people that have majorly been caught up in the wake of our addiction. They have gone through damage or emotional damage or financial damage because of our inability to be good husbands or good fathers or good sons or daughters or wives or whatever it may be. People have been caught up in the wake of our addiction. And sometimes we haven't really had to ever come to grips with that. The reality is we maybe decided to go to treatment and we were told it's so good. A lot of times you're praised when you're ready to get sober as an addict. People say, good for you. You're finally getting ready to take care of yourself. And something we often hear before we get sober is people say, you have to be willing to do it for yourself and nobody else. And so even in the beginning stages of our recovery, so much of our thoughts are internal and based off of ourselves. But the reality is that it's so many people have been harmed in the wake of our addiction, and it's time for us to start coming to grips with that and coming to that reality. And so in this step, we're not even at the point where we are going to make amends with those people. We're taking the time to really think through, who are these people? How might I have harmed them? And asking the question, am I willing to make amends to these people? And then working through the ability to come to the point of that willingness. The second question I would ask is just, why are some people harder to make amends with than others? It's a really hard question, but I think the truth is that many people that we need to make amends with or that we start to think of in the beginning are maybe just people that we've told simple lies to, or maybe they're people that we have stolen from, or they're people that it's a really tangible, like they were the victim and we were the perpetrator in our addiction. They hadn't done anything to deserve what we have brought upon them, but they did get caught up in the wake of our addiction. And it's really easy for us to think through those people and think about, okay, yeah, like I'm totally comfortable coming to those people and basically just asking them to forgive me and saying, hey, I recognize that through my addiction, I harmed you and you didn't deserve that. And I was wondering if you would forgive me. But the reality is that is not the only category. And the truth is, when it comes to addiction, oftentimes part of the root issue of why we've used is because we've been harmed by other people. Oftentimes, those people that have harmed us are people that are close to us. And so the reality is, we still are responsible to make amends with those people. But why is that difficult? Because we don't always feel like they deserve for us to apologize, because they may have done damage to us along the way. Or we may even be thinking to ourselves, if it wasn't for you and the way that you've treated me, maybe I would have never ended up in my addiction or ended up struggling with these bad habits. And the chances are is that it's kind of your fault anyway. And we know as we work through recovery that's unhelpful thinking. That isn't the way to get sober, is by passing the buck. But when we start thinking about the people we have to make amends to, it can be incredibly difficult to think about starting to make amends to the people that have harmed us. I'm going to take a really quick break, and then I'd like to kind of finish up the concept that we were talking about making amends to the people that have harmed us, and talking a little bit about, does this step get easier as we move forward in our recovery? So I'm going to take a quick break and we will be right back. All right, so we left off talking a little bit about why is it still so important for us to make amends with people who may have caused a lot of damage to us as well. There are people in our lives in recovery that have also done a lot of harm to us. So yes, we have caused them harm in our addiction. They have been hurt by some of our actions, our decisions, but it can be easy for us to think to ourselves, why do I need to make amends to that person? They're probably the reason why I ended up an addict in the first place because of things that they have done to me, or feeling like, why do I need to make amends to that person when they have never made an effort to make amends with me for what the harm that they've caused me. If you have spent any time reading the scripture, I think it's you've probably heard of the Lord's Prayer. Even maybe if you haven't grown up in circles, in church circles, you've heard the Lord's Prayer. But there's the Lord's Prayer. Basically, Jesus was asked, Jesus, how should we pray? And Jesus responded by reciting the Lord's Prayer. And there's a section in the Lord's Prayer where Jesus says one of the things that we need to pray when we are praying to God is that He would forgive us as we have forgiven others who have trespassed against us. And basically what that's saying is asking God, forgive me in the same way that I have forgiven other people who have harmed me. And that can be a really sobering thought. I mean, essentially it's saying, God, if I haven't forgiven the people who have harmed me, then don't forgive me. Or if just, God, forgive me in the same way that I have chosen to show forgiveness to other people. I think that this is such an important thing because it's acknowledging that we don't deserve God's grace. It's acknowledging that, God, in the same way that you have chosen to forgive me, even though you have done nothing to me at all, you have done nothing to harm me or bring harm to my life, and I've still chosen to turn around and sin against you and be disobedient to you and basically go against everything that you've told me to be or told me to do, you've still chosen to forgive me. And so when you think about that perspective and you think about it from the lens of, okay, there's people in our lives that have harmed us and we have also harmed them back. Well, if God can forgive us when He's done nothing wrong to us and we've done everything wrong to Him and He can forgive us, then why can't we forgive others that we've harmed even when they've harmed us as well? And I do want to also acknowledge the fact that I understand that that is not an easy thing to do. I know that a lot of us have been severely damaged by people in our lives. There are things that they may have done to us that have caused deep, deep wounds. And I do not take that lightly. I think, again, that's why it's so important for us to recognize if you are not on step 8, if you haven't spent any time working through the steps, this isn't something that you even need to be thinking about right now. Right now, it's important for you to start at the beginning and really start working on some of the other issues that you deal with through the steps so that you can come to a place where you do feel like you can start making a list of the people that you had harmed and becoming willing to make amends to them. I want to acknowledge, friends, that I know that there has been major pain caused to you. I also want to acknowledge the fact that these words are just so much easier said than done. I get. And I'm in the same boat. There are people who have caused harm to me, and it is difficult for me to ever think about going to that person and saying sorry for what I've done because of the things that they have done to me. But I also want to encourage you to not push the cart before the horse. The reality is, even in this step number 8, we are not looking to actually make amends to these people yet. We are just making a list of these people and starting to work through what it might look like to become willing to make amends to them. So as you're making a list and you may write somebody down and you think to yourself, there is no way I will ever be able to make amends to this person. That's okay. Write their name down and move on, because you're going to take this list to a sponsor or somebody that's been working with you through your recovery, and they're going to help you start thinking through some of these things. They're also going to start helping you maybe get to the root issue of why is it so difficult for you to even want to make amends to this person. So don't worry about what that might even look like to make amends to that person. Just put the name down, and then later on you can start thinking through some of what that may tangibly look like. The last question I really want to kind of talk about today is just, does this step become easier over time? You know, just like we're talking about now, there's a lot of people in our lives that when we first start thinking about having to make amends to these people, we think there is no way I'm going to go talk to that person again. We may be just extremely nervous because of what we have done to them, or we just are not in a place where we're ready to forgive that person for what they've done to us. But the reality is, as This, just like anything else, is a muscle. As you begin to see what it looks like to make amends with people, you're going to start to understand that there is so much healing that comes along with it. There's something amazing that happens when we confess our sins to one another that brings us to a position where we can pray for one another and be healed. We've talked about that in previous steps, and I think that that's so applicable even now. And I also think that over time, right now, if this is your first time working through the steps, the reality is you are dealing with sometimes 10, 20, 30 years worth of wrongs that you've done to people, and it can feel so extremely overwhelming to think about having to make amends to all these people. But the reality is, you're going to start making amends to these people, and the list is going to get smaller. And then you're going to start to learn what it looks like to make amends to somebody right away when you've wronged them. So you're not continuing to pile up this list and have this weight of guilt over you. I think that there's some guilt that you may be carrying that you don't even really realize because you haven't taken the time to think about the people you've harmed and maybe the people that you need to make amends with. And you start to come to grips with some of those things and really thinking through who are these people that I've harmed. And when you start to make amends with these people, you're going to start feeling some of that guilt and hurt be lifted up off of you. Y'all, I hope this was something that encouraged you today. I hope you walk away feeling like there is something tangible that you may be able to do after listening to this show. I said at the beginning of this season, there's certain steps that will leave us feeling really good and encouraged, unknowing that God is on our side and we're going to start moving forward in our recovery. And there are some steps that can leave us feeling kind of anxious or nervous. And I don't know how you're feeling after this one, but I do feel like this is one of those steps that can leave you feeling a little bit anxious or heavy-hearted. If that's the case for you, I would just want to encourage you again with a verse that we recite all the time on this podcast, but that is, for a mind set on the flesh is death, but a mind set on the spirit is life and peace. Friends, God isn't asking you to do this alone. He wants to walk with you. He wants to walk alongside of you as you continue to make amends for the wrongs that you have done. He has asked us to do this, and so he's not going to send us out to do this alone. Have faith that God is with you and that he is going to be with you every step along the way. I love you all so much. I'm so thankful for you that continue to listen every single week. I also want to remind you all that I have another short form podcast called the Sobriety Short Show. I talk about some of these concepts in a little bit of a shorter form. So if you like what you hear here, don't hesitate to head over and listen to that show as well. It would mean the world to me. Otherwise, y'all have an amazing rest of your week, and we'll talk soon.